Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the US population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Good afternoon, Ashley Brown. I looked at my clock. Yeah, way to go. Afternoon.
I know. Normally we're in the morning, so see, we're shaking it up and doing afternoon taping today.
But we realized it, so go us. Go us.
Yes. Yes. I'm super excited about today.
Good. What are you excited about?
Well, I'm excited, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about what the last show was about, but I'm really excited to talk about some of the root causes and why we are where we are, what kind of drives some of the thinking.
Are we where we are?
Are we where we are?
How did we get here?
Yeah, and some of the root causes, because I think, we're certainly in a time where people want that immediacy of instant gratification and, here's a simple answer and we're going to wrap this all up. And it's really way more complex than that. So, but interesting and fascinating. So, and informative.
And if we have time, I had a very interesting text conversation with a good friend this morning who was saying, it's not just systems, it's all about people. How did people get us to where we are? And why do they keep us where we are? So maybe we'll get into some of that.
Yeah.
The last show, we had a very interesting talk, if you missed it, about the government and do genders tend to see the government differently because of what their lived experiences have been. So I think that's worth checking out. It's one facet, but it's certainly very timely today as the US and some other countries really look at the role of government and cutting government and that sort of thing. Yep.
Well, and it ties in again with perceptions, right?
Yes, and lived experiences. Lived experiences.
Yeah, maybe lived experience. So do you begin at the beginning?
Yeah, I wanted to call this history of patriarchy or how we got to where we are today in 30 minutes or less, but that sounded a little grandiose. So first I'm going to have a disclaimer, and we are starting at the beginning, about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Disclaimer, I am not a historian. I like to do my research, and I've read a lot about this, but I'm not a historian. So, and this is an evolving field. But how we got to where we are with gendered roles probably begins 10 to 12,000 years ago. That's when most people think patriarchy as a system really developed fully, or began developing, I should say. It's evolved, but began developing. There were some early theories that it had to do with settled agriculture. Many of those have really considered not to be as accurate to the extent that we know. But the best theory and most deeply researched I've read comes from a book called The Patriarchs, which is in our show notes, about how the elite of these very early societies they wanted power, they wanted empire building, they wanted resources, they sometimes had to make war with other civilizations, and these roles these needs force them or push them into wanting more men for war and women to basically reproduce. They needed bodies. They needed higher populations was literally a concern then. So for a variety of ways, they started slowly building societies so that there were more gender divisions. And men had a role, specifically war making. They would go out and meet the needs of the state, and women were encouraged / required or put into a role where they would be having children and creating what were then considered resources. And remember, people didn't live very long those days too. So you started having babies early, and if maternal mortality didn't get you, you didn't last very long.
Right. Well, and it's interesting that, you even hear hunting and gathering is the role of the male and the female. So, I mean, it really, but I think when you put it in context of how far back it goes to when the notions of what our roles are supposed to be.
Right, that we started these gender segregation, roles segregated by gender. I mean, societies divide themselves in different roles, obviously, but having these kind of fixed roles by gender from birth, essentially, not just waiting till the person's skills and attributes and interests emerge, as we like to think about, but because you are born this gender, here's what your role is going to be. Obviously, I'm not denying biological changes, women bear children, etc. But most early research says that women were very active in agriculture, as were men, that they were also hunter-gatherers. So I think it's really interesting to read about how, for the desire for larger and more organized nation states, essentially, you had the need then for war, you needed more people. So the thinking is that that slowly developed some of the structures, some of the institutions, some of the norms that we have today, that it wasn't just a one-time thing, but that it really built over, now, of course, we're talking thousands of years. Um, so we could talk a little bit about some recent changes, and how, because, but we've got this 10 to 12,000 years of gradual divisions. Many
Well,
people,
and
yeah.
I think it's important to remind us, and I know that we'll be talking about this a little more in depth, of it's not that long ago that women had property rights. You know, if you looked at all your rights as a woman were tied to either your father or then your husband. And just keeping with the US, let's not even go back, but you know, in it was 2 centuries ago, so not that long ago, that our opportunities as women were tied to a man, right?
Yes, pretty much. Either your father or your husband. It has really only been, I mean, in the US, really since the 50s, but especially since the 70s, since women were able to do things like open their own bank account,
Mm-hmm.
get their own credit card. Certainly, we don't want to underestimate the role of things like widespread and more safe birth control. Women could control their fertility for some of the first times. That led to all kinds of things. It certainly led to more sex outside marriage. Now you didn't have men controlling and only knowing who was the father of their children. You had both genders having
Mm-hmm.
heterosexual sex because you had this birth control revolution. Also, too, in the US, divorce laws began to liberalize, really all over the world, and especially in the West. Divorce laws liberalized, and that gave, again, you could argue both parties, but certainly it was a big change for women. Now, often,
Mm-hmm.
many societies before, there was much easier for a man to request or get a divorce than for a woman. So she was in a very dependent role. There's no question. And there's an interesting history to the dependent role I want to squeeze in, is that early societies, women were typically married quite young, 13 or 14, the beginning of puberty, to
Mm-hmm.
sort of control birth. And often the husbands they were married to would be 10 or 15 years older. So this really started an understandable notion that the husband would speak for the family unit. He was the quote unquote head of household because basically he's married to what's, practically a child. So
Mm-hmm.
because of the age differences and the differences in experience and dependence, you had a much more vulnerable woman just because of age and experiences. It wasn't like two peers in some way meeting up. So you start this tradition of a woman marrying an older man, which
Mm-hmm.
was quite prevalent until pretty recently. You wanted to marry an older man, and the head of household. You have got a 28-year-old with basically a child. It made sense, and some of that still perpetuates today.
Well, and especially if you look at that age difference, if you have a teenager
Hmm.
married to a 30-year-old, it
Sure.
would make, you wouldn't even have the wherewithal to have strong opinions. Do you know what I mean?
Especially without the information that we think of today. People were so much more isolated. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
today, we're there's a global gender equity report which measures across countries. I highly encourage people to look it up. It's really cool if you like that kind of data. But the US is 42nd in the globe, just so people have a number. So there's 41 countries ahead of us who are quote unquote better in terms of gender parity. And they look at things that can be measured, objective, um, educational outcomes, health outcomes, pay gaps, that sort of thing. So just for a little pin on the map, you might say we are 42nd in the world, and obviously our economy is still the biggest in the world, and we haven't managed gender parity.
So you used a word I'm going to push into you a little bit to just give more context. Gender parity. What do you mean by that?
This is not a dictionary definition, but it's a good one. Equivalency across these indicators. So, for example, life expectancy. Do we have
Mhm.
men and women living to be about the same way? If we did, we'd have what we call gender parity across that indicator. attaining high school diplomas. We
Hmm.
basically have gender parity for high school diplomas in this country. In fact, we have more women graduating. For a long time, women were far behind. We did not have parity. It's equivalence. Again, people's lives are different, but it's equivalence across things that can be measured.
Hmm.
We look at, for example, for political parity, we might look at how many elected leaders are female. That's one indicator. The US only, we have perhaps a third of many of our legislative branches are female. So that's another indicator. Do they have rough parity of positions in elected office? So that's what they look at.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's just an important differentiation between, you know, equality doesn't mean equal. I think I've heard you say that. It's more about the parity of it doesn't mean that what I have, you have to have the exact same. And
No, and I think that leads to one is a common misunderstanding about gender equality that leads many people to I would say oppose it or find it difficult is they assume that if gender equality means we're all going to be the same in some sort of gender neutral, I don't know what they picture, a space age kind of human who
Mhm.
exhibits no roles that we associate with masculinity or femininity. And that's not true. It says we have equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities. Gender
Mhm.
equality is equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities because of our gender. So we have
Yeah.
that, we can have equality. And then people can have as many of these, I would say, outside trappings of femininity or masculinity as they so choose. Those are lifestyle choices. The
Mhm.
colors of your clothes or how
Mhm.
you dress or those things are lifestyle choices, not issues of gender equality.
Right. Well, and when we talk about the gender boxes of what's male, what's female, and how we've gotten here, it's a long, again, a long road of language, expectations.
Yeah, and then maybe we should say a little bit about what's in these so-called gender boxes. And that's
Hmm.
means it's the way we're socialized. And there's a woman named Gina Rippon who's a neuroscientist in the UK, and I'll put her book in the show link and some videos she's done. She talks a lot about the plasticity of the brain, which now, of course, we know so much about. It was just hypothesized, 1 or 200 years ago. But the plasticity of the brain and how the early brain picks up on socialization, the same way it picks up on language and so many things. I mean, our brains are hardwired to pick up on social cues. And lo and behold, gender differences are one of those social cues that infants pick up on from very, very early. And if they continue to do this, there's this creation of what are called gender boxes. And these are generalizations, but inside the be a man or be a boy box are desire for dominance. You will see boys play, often boys play quote unquote rough. People will talk
Hmm.
about roughhousing. This is literally mimicking what the sociologists call dominance play. They're beating one another up, you might say. Much more stereotypically male and boy. People would say, well, that's the way boys are. That's the way we socialize them. It's not the way they're born. That's so-called dominance play when they're young. Obviously, that translates into other forms of dominance sometimes in adults. Having physical or sexual prowess is deeply coded with being male, and especially not doing things that are feminine.
Hmm.
You know that slurs still, both for boys, teenagers, adult men, is to say a man is, I could use slang terms that I probably can't use on the show, but to say that a man is a girly, let's just say,
Right.
that's the height of an insult. Think about that. That height of an insult is you say that a man is being in some way feminine.
Mhm.
That's really deeply insulting. So that says about if you're a man, you pick up this notion that you really don't want to do anything feminine. And of course, for girls, as these plastic brains develop, they pick up the cues that what's so important is appearance. They need to look in a way so that they will be desired, accepted, wanted, protected. Someone will have them. Think about the origins of our dependent role. You
Right.
want to look in a way that you will be looked after and taken care of. Women also, by the way, will police each other's appearance in many ways. This is a highly coded thing. And women have learned to be caregivers and to read social cues. We talk about how women communicate more and talk to their girlfriends or something. We've been socialized to read analyze these social cues. If you know a group of middle school girls where it seems like the most dramatic things in life are these seemingly trivial social ups and downs, what they're doing is they're going through and they're practicing these social cues that they've got to read the nuances of what's happening with people. They've got to be taken care of, they've got to be protected in some sense.
Hmm.
So we've got these boxes, and they are still there. There's a fascinating study. Johns Hopkins University did a global study, 15 cities. They asked 11 to 14, 10 to 14 year olds all these questions. And they were even amazed. Readers were amazed about the degree of gender norms that they had picked up. And again, this is global, everywhere that boys are, boys are more dominant, boys are more prone to violence, boys should lead, girls are weaker and need protection, picked up all across the board. They also have very rigid notions about who does what jobs because they've seen all this. This is the way they have seen and they've absorbed these roles. So, socialization is one of the things that
Yeah.
really is a root cause today.
Well, and I don't know, is this a good time to dive into also some of the media influences?
Oh, yeah, that's a more modern one, no question. And it is definitely a root cause because now we know that we aren't shaped just by the people in our clan or village or family or even
Hmm.
school. We're shaped so much by media. When I say media, I mean not just television, traditional television, film, advertisements, internet, radio, everything that's out there. There's amazing studies, which you can also do now because of the ability to, data mine it, that show how biased the media is. And when I mean biased, when I say biased, I mean, for example, men are far more likely to have more screen time. When they are portrayed on screen, they're far more likely to be in a decision-making role. Women are far more likely to be in a caretaking dependent role. And this is picked up through subtle ways. For example, in advertisements. So say you don't even watch something big, but you see ads all over,
Hmm.
ads are just all around. Men have three times the amount of speaking time in ads. What the product is they're hawking, three
Oh,
times more
interesting.
speaking time. So again, you see one ad, you're not going to think about that. What's the big deal? Think about the subliminal impact. Men are authorities. They speak to, this is the product, this is the thing.
Hmm.
That's who we see speaking all the time. Um, Other film and TV, video games, there's been lots of studies. So the stereotypical portrayals, women are far more likely to be what I think I would call scantily clad, basically wearing less clothing. Many, many times women have very little clothing and men are fully clothed. So you have this disparity. It's not like a couple is getting naked with each other. It's like you've got this disparity. So that
Hmm.
perpetuates this notion of appearance and the role. Um, Men are far more likely to also, I would say, be stereotyped in ways that they might not like. They're sometimes portrayed sort of as doofuses around children and infants. I'm sure you've seen movies where men can't figure out how to change a diaper. They're
Right.
really portrayed as sort of buffoony in these settings, right?
Hmm.
That doesn't help us either. And think about all the action heroes and all of the action films we have and the overly hyped masculine physique that's developed that is the hero, from the Arnold
Hmm.
Schwarzeneggers to obviously the computer generated images we have today. These kind of uber masculine physiques are seen as saviors. So there's also masculine stereotyping that probably isn't helping our men either. The point is, it's putting us into these gender boxes. We don't realize it. We're just being exposed to it. Our children are being exposed to it for hours and hours a day. So media is very influential for this.
Well, and I think that, not to belabor the point too much, but oftentimes when we talk about gender equity, gender parity, any of that, it's always seen from, or maybe this is just my lived experience, from the female.
Hmm.
But the reality is, men are, I hate to use the word victims, but the same stereotypes, the same gender boxes are perpetuating their expectations. And a statistic that you've talked about, that something that goes along the number of suicide or the suicide rate for men versus women, it's higher for men. Not being able to, like, if their desire was to be a stay-at-home dad because they really wanted to take care of kids, there's a lot of judgment that goes around that. And why are you choosing to do something that's women's work or female? So, no one's winning in the gender
Yeah,
boxes.
I would agree. When I always talk about gender equality as opposed to women's equality, because these things are, they're meshed, they're married, if you will.
Right.
And you're right, boys are much more likely to be the victims of physical violence than girls. Boys
Mhm.
are much more likely. They do have a lower life expectancy in many countries, suicide rates, substance abuse rates. There's a lot of research now into what's called a socialization or a friend issue for boys. And I hesitate to call it a friend, boys and men. I hesitate to call it a friend issue because that feels sort of trivial, but it really isn't. It's indicating that many men, not all, but many men and boys struggle to find socialization that meets their needs. They really are
Mhm.
struggling to have these partnerships or friendships or relationships and communication that is satisfying, that we as humans need to reveal our vulnerabilities, to talk about our problems, to enjoy light times, all those kind of things. Much harder for men. There's no question. And we are social beings as humans.
Mhm.
And so we're
Yeah.
increasingly socializing our men and boys for whatever reason that, that's not okay. It just doesn't come easily. They don't see those models, except maybe in a bar. When you're in a bar, you'll see men talking on media, right? That's
Right.
when you have alcohol to kind of loosen things, but much less just, casual interactions.
So one of the things before we kind of move on to what are our opportunities, when we talk about root cause, when we talk about the gender socialization, it's not only at home, but it's what are we socialized to be acceptable career paths,
Hmm.
and where that leads to gender wage gap and gender asset gap.
And
Um,
we know,
yeah, I would like
this is
for you
both
to talk about
cause
that.
and consequence. And
Hmm.
so we're socialized to certain jobs to be more acceptable. They're still seeing women and girls that perceive they aren't as good at math. If you listen to the Gina Rippon video, she talks actually about the impact of girls believing this, hearing this, how it affects their performance. It's fascinating. So we are socialized to that. That leads us to certain jobs. It also leads men to certain jobs. And that perpetuates this notion. It can perpetuate cultures that are inhospitable. A very male workplace, even if they don't discriminate legally, it can feel very inhospitable to women in some settings. So that is perpetuating. It becomes both the consequence of these structures and a cause of it. It fits into women having less economic power, having a lifetime asset gap. Women are much likely to be poorer late in life, much more likely to need government assistance late in life because they live so much longer. So it becomes this vicious circle. There's also a lot of thinking, I shouldn't say thinking, it's pretty well established that gender-based violence is also perpetuated by this notion that if the man believes he needs to be dominant and therefore control, it may lead to control in ways that are completely inappropriate, controlling a woman's movement, dress, her
Hmm.
clothing, that sort of thing, which is not necessary or appropriate today. And that in and of itself then becomes a problem. A woman may have a harder time having gainful employment in that setting if her movements are controlled. Then she has more dependence. So it becomes this vicious circle from all these factors.
Well, and we also have women who lean into upholding the traditional patriarchal roles and the expectations for other women. And I don't know that we talk about that enough.
Thank you. It's so true. And I often say we are all socialized with this stuff. We all are. We didn't create these systems. We didn't create this. We've all had this since birth, if you will. I don't know if you remember the first time you were sort of aware of soft social differences about gender that, vis-a-vis boys. I don't know if you grew up with brothers or something. Do you remember when it first occurred to you?
I do, and we're just going to ignore that phone ringing. It's going to be fine.
Okay.
Um, so in our house, I was the only girl, so in the baby, and it was boys did yard work. I did dishes and set the table.
Yeah.
So, and it was just never, and I remember thinking, why do the boys never have to do the dishes after dinner? And it was like, well, they mow the grass. So, I
Mm.
mean, it was very much of the traditional roles. So that just popped into my mind when you said that of like, and it started young.
Yeah. And many people will, if they think about it, before they started being, intellectualizing it, they have some sort of memory like that where it dawns on them like, oh, wait a minute, there's like this difference here. What's going on here kind of
And
thing.
another one that I'm going to say, and then we're going to have to wrap, which stinks because we have more stuff to talk about. But my brother's curfews were always later, and my parents were like, well, when you're a senior, you can be, but it never got later because what was appropriate for boys versus girls to be out late. So, and I think that's another.
Boys and girls' behavior, yep, they need to be protected. Implicitly, is their sexuality needs to be protected, but your parents probably didn't say that. But
Right.
implicitly, yes. Oh yeah, we
Yeah.
can go on longer than that, but I'd really love to at least give people a couple of suggestions. We've given
Yes.
this whole thing. So, there are things we can do because the socialization is so important. I always say, don't let the small stuff slide. Don't, socialization is built up of small things. Yes, we want to maybe change legal systems, but conversations with people, modeling in the home, what you do with children, who's washing the dishes, who isn't. Don't let that small stuff, don't think it's immaterial or irrelevant. Start young if you have young people, but even if you don't, you can be modeling for others. You've got to model. We don't have enough models of what this looks like in healthy relationships to be more egalitarian, I would say, and kind of break out of these gender roles. So we need to model it as much for each other, in a
Hmm.
healthy, positive way. Do check out the resources because it's important that people realize that all of these roles are not biologically driven. And that we don't need to be locked into these roles that aren't helping us out anymore. And I would also say it's very understandable that people are reluctant to change. These things are very deep-seated. Religions perpetuate them, which we haven't talked
Hmm.
about. But small changes absolutely can happen, and they will benefit us all.
Well, and I think as we're saying goodbye to this episode, it is the feeling of it has been in these last 55 years that so much of a shift has happened, which does make people uncomfortable. As to quote my friend Scott Osborne, change is hard, and changes like this make people uncomfortable and all of the things. So it is some back and forth, and I think the willingness to talk is always important.
Yeah. We're
Yeah.
social animals, and so we try to read the cues, and this is what society's
Mhm.
giving us. So
Yeah.
some of it I would like to say is understandable. I don't like the way some of it is, but I understand where it's coming from.
No, absolutely. Well, as always,
Thanks,
thank you
Ashley.
for a great conversation. I'm going to repeat, check out you found some or shared some great
Yep.
resources in the show notes, so check them out. I can't wait to watch the TEDx. I think that's going to be interesting. And until next time,
Thank you, Ashley. Take care. Have a good
thanks,
week.
Scott.